welcome back to the channel. I'm going to be making 3 different projects today. One is a table runner for Thanksgiving, and the next 2 are basically the same. They are wall hangings made out of mini turkeys with the word thankful written on them. From the pattern that I got from the link of the Missouri Star Quilt Company tutorial on a turkey wall hanging. I went through my fabric bins and found a variety of different colors to use for the feathers for the turkeys. If you saw my video for the large turkey thankful wall hanging, you saw how I made the pattern for the feathers. And this is a little different because it's a little smaller, but I'll leave the link to that in the description box. The dimensions are 2 inches at the widest part, or 1 15/16, 1 inch at the smallest part, and then the length is 3.5 inches. If you have a Dresden plate ruler, go ahead and use that, but you'll not want your bottom measurement to be larger than 1 inch in dimension. Otherwise, your circle or your turkey feather round may not fit the circle of the turkey body. So here I am stacking some fabric pieces to cut. I have the pattern piece on top. The fabric is a little larger than 3.5 inches long and a little wider than 2 inches wide. And so, with a straight edge, I cut the feather pieces out. You may be able to do more than 4 pieces of fabric at a time, but that's about what I can do. You're going to need about 13 to 14 feather pieces for each turkey. At the sewing machine now, I take a turkey feather and fold it in half with the right sides facing each other, and at the largest part, then go ahead and make a 1/4 inch seam. I like to fix it or tack it down at the start and at the end. I go ahead and chain piece at one time all of the feather pieces that I have cut out. And you end up with a cute little garland at the end. Clip those apart and then turn it right side out so that you have a cute little feather. You can use scissors or something blunt that has a point that you can push that fabric out to the very end. I like to clip the corner a little bit, but make sure that you don't clip the stitching. I take those pieces to the iron and give them a quick press. Then I take those feather pieces and sew 2 together and chain piece them until I have a nice stack of 2 feathered pieces. Then I take the 2 feathered pieces and sew 2 together and end up with a stack of 4 feathered pieces. And I keep doing this until I end up with enough feathers to make a turkey. And then I take those to the ironing board and give them a press with the seams all going in one direction on the back, and then press them down flat on the front. Since the ends are not seamed together with another feather, they need to be turned under and pressed really well. I have some lengths of fabric here that I think would look nice as background fabrics. On this top one, that's a gold fabric, I've decided to use the back of it instead so that it looks more like a beige or tan or light gold. And I'm just laying the pieces on top of them to see if I like them, kind of auditioning them. I'm just cutting out the background fabrics now. I'm making 3 projects altogether. 2 of them will be the Thankful turkey wall hangings that are smaller than the one I made previously about a month ago. And then the third one will be a table runner consisting of 3 panels with turkeys and pumpkins on them. I just have to trace a few more pieces to iron onto my fabric, and one is this Thankful writing. I used the pattern that came on the Missouri Star Quilt Company's tutorial of the Thankful wall hanging, and I shrunk it down to half the size on my computer or printer. So you saw there that I was ironing the Wonder Under onto the fabric, and you need a hot iron to do that, and press it for about 10 seconds. And now I'm cutting out my background fabrics and my fabrics for the backing, and just making sure that everything looks good together. Right here, I had a little bit of binding left from another project, but I'm cutting some more fabric out for the binding to the one wall hanging. All the pieces needed to be ironed really well before the Wonder Under pieces were ironed onto them. I chose this brown fabric with little circles on it to be the backing for this background fabric that I have in beige. The background fabric and batting on this are 12.5 inches by 14.5 inches. The backing is 1 inch all around larger, so it is 14.5 inches by 16.5 inches. Instead of sewing on a binding on this project, I plan on wrapping the backing around the front, folding it over, and having that bind the edges. I center the turkey feathers and put the circle of the body and then the head and body and feet onto the background fabric. You need to peel the paper off first. I peel the paper off of the Thankful writing and put that on centered. There's a beak that also goes on there. And then after I have everything situated, then I go ahead and hit it with the iron that's on the highest setting and hold the iron on the pieces for 10 seconds. I also pinned the feathers in place since they don't have any kind of bonding agent or binding agent under them. And just to clarify, I'm using the small turkey head and feet from the pattern. And then I reduced the pattern for the writing down to 50% in size. The circle pattern is the same for large or small turkeys. Make sure the end feathers that we folded under are folded under before you iron on the turkey body. Sometimes they slip out of place. And I guess it wouldn't be the end of the world if you missed that, because it's kind of a rustic looking project anyway. This is the backing that I chose for the second wall hanging project. The background and backing fabrics and the batting all measure 12.5 by 14.5 inches on this project. And I made a binding that was 2.5 inches wide that I folded in half to use when we bind this. I ironed on all the pieces as I did in the first project. This is the first panel to the table runner. All 3 panels are 15.5 inches square, and they measure 45 inches in length when sewn together. The batting measures 15.5 inches by 45 inches. The backing fabric is 18.5 inches by 48 inches. It's 1.5 inches larger than the background and the batting to allow for binding when we're done. So I really goofed on this panel when it came to ironing on the pieces with the wonder under. As mistakes go, it wasn't horrible or awful, but what I did was I forgot to take the paper off of these 2 pieces that I'm ironing now, the 2 pumpkins. And the paper eventually came off, but just know that when you double iron this wonder under, that it makes it very difficult to get the paper off. And once I did, I was able to iron the pieces back on, and I didn't have to make new pieces, so it worked out fine. This one plaid looking orange fabric that I have is a really loose weave, and so it looked a little more ruffled up than the other one. But like I said before, this is a rustic looking project, and so that just adds to part of the charm, I think. These are going to be top stitched with a blanket stitch on my machine, and they turned out looking just fine. So if you end up doing the same mistake, don't worry about it. It will be fine. On to pinning and ironing everything down with the second panel, and then now with the third panel. I'm cutting the batting for the table runner now, and again those measurements are 15.5 by 45 inches. I cut the backing for the table runner at 18.5 and a little bit bigger than 48 inches. You'll see that after I quilt the table runner that I go back and trim up the top and the bottom edges to make the dimension 48 inches. I'm now sewing the 3 panels for the table runner together. After that, I pressed the seams to one side and pressed everything nice and flat with a hot iron, and then laid it out onto the batting and backing fabrics. After I got everything nice and straight and evened out and completely smoothed out, then I pinned the sandwich together with quilting pins. Then I did the same thing to both wall hangings. I like to stitch in between each feather, going from the base of the circle outward. If you do it the opposite way, going from the outward part of the feather to the inside to the circle, then it has more of a tendency to pucker at the circle. After I stitched in between each feather, then it's time to do a blanket stitch around the outside of the feathers. And on my machine, I used the stitch that was number 24 for that. Later on, when I stitched the legs and the beak, I used a tighter blanket stitch, and that was number 26 on my machine. You could hand embroider this if you wanted to, or you could just use your straight stitch on this. But the tops of the feathers need to be tacked down somehow. I finished top stitching with the blanket stitch around the tops of the tail feathers, and here is what it looks like. Next, I went on to the other wall hanging and finished those off as well. Then I also top stitched around the circle part of the body of the turkey. Then I did the turkey body, the part that looks like a bowling pin, and that was a little more challenging because it had little deeper curves to it. Lastly, I went around the feet and the beak with the tighter blanket stitch. Next, I went on to do the top stitching on the table runner, which was about the same but required a little bit of rolling up the ends and maneuvering it between the open part of the machine. The panels of the table runner also had pumpkins on them that I top stitched. And some of these are better than others, and there are a few goofs, but nothing bad enough that I was willing to pick out. After all of the top stitching is done, then I trim off a few little pieces of batting on the table runner and then trim the top and the bottom border to make it consistent with the side overhang of 1.5 inches. On the first wall hanging, I rolled up the binding to the front of the background fabric and went ahead and top stitched just a plain straight line to secure the binding. Then stitch close to the edge of the binding. To see how I did the corners, keep on watching for when I do the corners of the table runner. If you wanted to use a zigzag stitch or a blanket stitch on the edge here, it would look really nice as well. On the second wall hanging, I did the binding differently and sewed on the binding that I had made to the front of the wall hanging. I sew the raw edges next to the raw edge of the wall hanging, and the folded edge goes towards the middle. Within 1/4 inch of the corner, I stop the machine with the needle down and then pivot the needle and then run it off the edge. I then make a fold to the top part of it, and then within 1/4 inch from the top, start my stitching down this next side. I do this on all 4 sides until I come to about 6 inches from where I started. And I didn't make note of this when I started, but it's important to say that when I started sewing, I left about 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 inches of binding before I even started stitching. And you need to have that play to be able to secure your binding together. We have a 2.5-inch binding, so we need to overlap 2.5 inches and trim the rest off. And here is where I messed up, and I don't know why I messed up, but I did. I measured 3 inches instead of 2.5. But I didn't realize what I'd done until I had sewed and picked out and sewed and picked out and couldn't figure out why it wasn't laying flat and a tight fit. I decided to take my walking foot off to help me with sewing the binding together. It just works better for me that way. So I put the two ends together, right sides facing and perpendicular to each other, and then sew from corner to corner. If you're having a hard time understanding this part of the binding, I'll put a link to Jenny Doan's binding tutorial in my description box. I think you'll find it very helpful. And I'll also put the link to Jenny Doan's video where she made the thankful wall hanging with the large turkey and the mini turkeys. So I don't know if you can tell by this, but it is looser than it should be. When I figured out what the problem was, I picked out the stitching and trimmed it another 1/2 inch and then sewed it back together again, and it was a perfect fit. And voila! All I need to do is trim off these edges and then sew the rest of it together. I will roll this over to the back and then stitch it down by hand. I decided to do a decorative embroidery stitch on either side of the two seams that are on the table runner. I'm just folding the overlap 2 times here to create the binding on the table runner. To finish off the corners, I just fold the top edge over like into a triangle, and then fold the binding over once and then over again to make a mitered edge. If you decide to do this project, you might decide to put more quilting on it than I have. If you have a free motion presser foot and you're good with that, you could do some meander lines or designs in these open areas here. If you don't do that, you could always fill it in with squares or diagonal lines. And of course, you could always take it to a long armor or somebody with a quilt machine, a business with a quilt machine that could quilt it. Or you could hand quilt it if you'd like to do that. I've chosen just to leave that space unquilted. And I can always go back and quilt it if I decide I want to later. I'm sewing the binding down now on the table runner, and I decided to do that by machine. So I start at one corner and tack it down, and then sew as close as I can to the edge without going off into the panel. I had the regular presser foot on because I had taken the walking foot off, and I thought it would be okay just sewing the binding on. But it was proving to be a little difficult and starting to pucker, so I decided before I got too much further that I would go ahead and take off the regular presser foot and put on the walking foot. And I picked out the little bit of stitching that I had done and then started again with the walking foot on it, and it worked out so much better. So I was happy that I had taken the time to do those things because I feel like it turned out much better by doing it that way. When I get to the corner, I stop with the needle in the corner in the fabric and then pivot the fabric to go the different direction and then continue stitching down that side of the table runner. Then finish up at the last corner by tacking it down. It's late at night, so the light is really bad, but this is what it looks like. And then I went on to trim all of the threads, all of the stray threads that were on the back, and also on the front. If you don't like the way all of this unquilted portion parts of this wall hanging look like, then you be sure to quilt yours when you make one. So here are the finished wall hangings. One is going to a friend in Utah, and the other is going to my nephew when he comes to visit us. If you want to, you can sew on a little ring on the back to be able to hang your wall hanging. I usually just put a safety pin on the back and use that as the hanger. There always seems to be a few stray threads that pop up after you think you've gotten them all. And here is the finished table runner that I will be keeping myself. These projects were fun to do, and if you enjoyed this video, you may enjoy the other video that I did with the larger turkey wall hanging, and also the video that Jenny Doan did for Missouri Star Quilt Company for the thankful turkey wall hanging. So if you're interested in those, I'll leave the links in the description box. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.